more comfortable than where we were last week. So we'll persevere here if you all can hang in there with us. If you have a question for you all who are on Zoom, do you all know how to kind of raise your hand through a graphic? Let me know, and we'll try to do this. I'm trying to work off a computer. I've got a microphone in front of me that makes me feel like I should be spinning records, and we'll all try to do this together. All right. Thank you. Well, let's go ahead and get into this. We're jumping in a little bit early, but for those who are just new to us, we spent last week talking about the prologue and the introduction, and if you've not had a chance to get through that, would really be good. One of the significant things I would say, just going over last year, she starts having grown up in the town in Iowa where Dordt College is, and Dordt College was where she went to school. She's a professor at Calvin College up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and is out of the Christian Reformed Church, which is basically the PCA church to the PCUSA church. So, she is no wide-eyed, liberal in any stretch of the imagination, but she starts by talking about when Trump came to Dordt College and all of the kind of pietistic things she had been taught as a kid that were part and parcel of what it would mean to be a Christian. This person seemed to have no connection with. How did he become sort of the poster boy of white evangelical Christianity? And her contention, and I think she's right, is it's perfectly understandable how that happened, looking at the culture that has come up. And now in this first chapter, she begins to trace the rise of that culture. There are going to be some really important touchstones with my own life that comes out of this. And as Carol, you suggested, there are for you and for others in the room as well. And so I want to be really clear that we're trying to discern how some of this came about. And we have to acknowledge how we're, part and parcel of that. Golly, watching Longest Day, I'm a huge John Wayne fan, right? One of my best boyhood buddies' dad's nickname was the Duke. This is so wrapped up in our own national identity. And yet when we don't look at those kinds of things, we sometimes unaware, buy into more than what's being offered, right? So we'll want to go ahead and take a look at the saddling up, the first paragraph, the path that ends, right? Not begins, but ends with John Wayne as an icon of Christian masculinity is strewn with colorful cast of characters, from the original cowboy president to a baseball player turned preacher to a singing cowboy and a dashing young evangelist. That's a pretty good opening paragraph. Now, I'm going to front load something here. And Carol Busey, you can't raise your hand. But for the rest of you, how many of you knew of Billy Sunday? Okay. We're going to get to Billy Sunday in a bit, but I'm here in no small part because of Billy Sunday. 1920, my grandfather had developed black lung from being a quarryman in slate quarries, granite quarries, marble quarries. He was out of work. His 45-year-old wife was pregnant with their fourth child, who would be born in February of 21. He had no prospects. He was down on his luck. He went to a Billy Sunday rally in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked the Sawdust Trail, shook Billy Sunday's hand, had a dramatic conversion experience, and my grandfather became an elder in the First Welsh Presbyterian Church of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, for the next 19 years until he died. My father was born in 21. My dad's experience of his father's embrace of Christianity was very different than his older siblings' experience of their father, because of what a transformational experience that was. So when I come to things like this, there are a lot of, mainline Presbyterians who are a little embarrassed of the whole Billy Graham crusades, that kind of stuff. But it is a deeply important part of my own family identity. And I can tell you, I'm here because my father became a person of faith, because I was raised in a church. I never knew my grandfather. He died 20 years before I was born. So I've done a lot of study on Billy Sunday, and sisters and brothers, he was wild. I mean, he was wild. You can actually get some clips of his preaching, I'm going to slide into second base to kick off the devil. I mean, it was just crazy kind of stuff, but he was speaking to something that was missing in the lives of some men. And, it'd be interesting, Carol, you may know what kind of response he had amongst the women folks, but exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody, you have to explain the pendulum swings the other way. And I think right now the pendulum is swinging the other way, not so much because of Donald Trump, but because of the internet and mass communication. And I think the communication has really distressed a lot of people, and so they're trying to grab onto something, and it's generally your faith.
Yeah.
Or finding your faith.
Yeah. Carol's saying, for those of you on, that in times of radical transformation in the country, there seems to be an opportunity for somebody to step in. And in our own time, some of this is about the hyper communications of internet and all of those, and folks are trying to find some stuff with faith. We'll get back to Billy Sunday in a little bit, but unable to shake the sense that Christianity had a less than masculine feel, many blame the faith itself, at least the feminization of Victorian Christianity, which privileged gentility, restraint, and an emotive response to the gospel message. But American masculinity, too, had recently undergone dramatic changes, contributing to a sense of unease. Through much of the 19th century, when most men made a living by farming or otherwise working with their hands, or by owning small businesses, masculinity seemed more than of a given. During this time, Christian manhood entailed hard work and thrift, and also the ability to exhibit a proper gentlemanly restraint. Self-denial, after all, was a useful virtue for entrepreneurial businessmen and industrious workers, but by the 1890s, this model of manly restraint had begun to falter. New corporate consumer economy meant more men were earning a living by punching the clock, and self-discipline no longer promised the same payoff. Thoughts about any of that? I remember reading a book a number of years ago, and again, I made this marginal note in my book on the top of 17 after that paragraph break. But I remember a couple of years ago reading a book, and I have to confess, I went to my library to look for books, and I've had to purge my library over the years of so many things, and this is when you just absolutely hate having to throw away your children. But poor Ken Handy, I wish you were here this morning, because when we did the renovation of the church a couple of years ago, Ken was one of the people who had to schlep the 50 boxes of books out of my office. And put them into storage. But I had a book, and it was interesting. It looked about the crisis of masculinity amongst the sons of Civil War veterans. That there was no way for them to prove their masculinity in the way their fathers had during that. And you know, Teddy Roosevelt, how many of you know Teddy Roosevelt has Georgia roots? You ever been to Roswell, Georgia, and there's the Bullock House in Roswell, which was just up the street from where Lillian Carter lived for a time. But that was his mother's family. And so he sort of got stories from his uncles about being in the Civil War and all of this. And this article made, this book rather, made the argument that there was this attempt for those men who were the sons of Civil War soldiers. So in the 1880s, 90s, you know, trying to come to grips with what did all of that mean when there wasn't a way to show it in the way their fathers had. And I always thought that was a really interesting thing that I had not really thought of in the past. And he talks about the wave of immigrants and the new women, you hussies wearing bloomers and riding bicycles and having fewer babies and entering the professions and getting your hair bobbed and all of that. Gosh, what's going to happen? And then, of course, no one advanced this new American masculinity with more gusto than Teddy Roosevelt. Who amongst us counts Teddy as one of their heroes? There are a couple of us who look to Teddy, and you know, one of the reasons I love him is you can't pin the rascal down. I mean, he is this progressive Republican who goes into the inner cities of New York and against his class and elites begins to have a heart for these immigrants that are in absolutely awful situation and forces folks to do something about it. I mean, she is of necessity sort of painting a caricature of Roosevelt, which I think is fair, honestly. When I was a boy, we had a absolutely fabulous public library in my hometown. And some of you heard me say, I didn't spend hours there. I spent days there. My mother worked in City Hall next door. And so, you know, when I was 8, 9, 10, childcare in the summer was taking the kids to the public library and leaving them there all day, you know. And I remember working my way through all of the children's books. And finally, when I was about 12, 11, I finally said, can I go over to the adult section and start reading biography there? And one of the first biographies I read was a 600-page biography on Eddie Rickenbacker. It's still one of my favorite biographies ever, because it really teaches you about the 20th century, but he's very much out of this mold as well. You know, a guy who learned how to work with his hands, a race car driver, then a pioneer of aviation, and World War I hero in the Sopwith Camel. And, you know, in the Second World War, he goes down in the Pacific. He's lost on a raft for 21. I mean, this guy's life was unbelievable. But I remember reading a biography of Teddy Roosevelt when I was a kid. And I had some asthma issues myself. And, you know, so you think about getting over it and succeeding, and later reading some of the more critical biographies about who's got somebody's got a note, thanks. And old Teddy got the Panama Canal built. That's right, Cynthia. The path through the river, or through the forest. But one of the great things in one of the later biographies is, you know, he would love when somebody from Europe came to visit him at the White House, some French minister, go take a walk in Rock Creek Park. And it's basically put on a Bataan death march and have this guy in frock coat trying to keep up with him, you know, as a way to humiliate him. Anyway, but this is important, I think. The Wild West could mold the exquisite Mr. Roosevelt into a rugged masculine specimen. Perhaps it could do the same for American manhood generally, so the thinking went. But there was a flaw in this plan. Even as Roosevelt was honoring his masculinity on the Western frontier, the mythical West was fading away. And so this is going to be an important thing about, you know, what we hold up as the West and what becomes the mythical West. I know my dad was raised on a steady diet of cowboy movies when he was a young guy, and as she suggests here, a lot of that is basic morality plays. Who's got the white hat? Who's got the black hat? You know, what's right to do and all of that. Some of you were in a book study I did a number of years ago of one of my favorite books, My Antonia, by Willa Cather. But the thing about that book is it's being written, you know, as this great celebration of the West, but as that West is already eclipsing. And it came out in 1918. Anybody know what happened yesterday? A bust of Willa Cather went up in the White House, or I mean, in the Capitol. Yeah, so big thing. All right, Roosevelt's Rough Riders, the town next to mine, Catasauqua, Pennsylvania. They were the Rough Riders. So that worked. What is interesting about the Rough Riders? Anybody know much about Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders? So they were New York upper crust folks who were kind of in his set. They were cowboys from out in his Montana, North Dakota ranching days. And they were, you know, other folks like from Arizona. There were these, it was also a real kind of mixing of different groupings, which makes them kind of interesting. All right. That last paragraph on 16, when Roosevelt became president in 1901, the embodiment of heroic American manhood became the undisputed leader of the American nation by fashioning a violent, fantasized masculinity and then injecting the sensibility in national politics. Roosevelt offered ordinary men the sense they were participating in a larger cause. Roosevelt's hypermasculinity appealed to men anxious about their own status and the nation's. For many, these anxieties would become inseparable. What do you think about that sentence? Yeah, we trace it back to him, but I think what she's going to argue is John Wayne becomes the real popular symbol of this, for good or ill. But you know, you're not probably wrong. But I think she's in this chapter looking at what are the streams that get us into John Wayne. Yeah. Anybody else? Janet, you're smiling. No? Okay.
We're still again. Hypermasculinity, the nation.
I think we are. And I guess one of the things that I'd want to suggest or at least explore out of what she's saying here, is it a response to a sense of anxiety? Yeah, and I think whenever there's economic display, any of those kinds of things, you know, what does it mean? And of course, what we're seeing is, you know, rates of kids going to college. Girls are now outpacing men. You know, how do we understand that? And what do we do with that? Yeah. So American Christians, the challenge was to reconcile this aggressive new masculinity with traditional Christian virtues. Virile, aggressive men could hardly be expected to submit themselves to the emasculating faith And so in the 1910s, Christian men set out to remasculize American Christianity. I was really surprised that she didn't mention another important movement that came out around this time. Now, it was started in England in the 1840s, but the YMCA movement in the United States kind of combines this out. And again, my dad didn't finish high school before the Second World War, but he started working at a YMCA. And that became a real, in fact, it became much more important part of his own kind of Christian identity than having gone to a well-speaking church 3 times a week growing up. He used to put what did he tell me, a Reader's Digest in the hymnal and read something in English because all of the preaching and everything else was in Welsh. You know, it's like, none of that. He used to tell me, you know, when you read a passage and it says about the Hittites and the Canaanites and the Jebusites and all that, don't preach on that. I think he heard way too many of those sermons growing up.
Right, people are checking, now wait, what time frame are we in here?
Right.
There's like, Victorian Christianity is not masculine enough. Even after the First World War, Christianity isn't masculine enough. But there's no doubt that men were still in leadership. They were the leaders in all the Christian organizations. So it's very interesting.
It is. And I do think one of the things that happens, though, in the Victorian era, in particularly, is men do manly things and women really are the ones who are the dominant in the home and teaching the faith and those kinds of things. So even though you're absolutely right that, you know, men are in the leadership, and of course, one of the things that we're seeing lived out in our own life here is for many years, the women's circles were so important in the church, but they were important because they were ways and areas that women could literally have power and leadership. And but now that women share power with men, those circles are not as vibrant as they once were. So we have that, but I think what she is suggesting about that Victorian sense is that women are the softer ones and take care of the stuff at home, and part of that home is the faith. But to counter that, especially after the Second World War, in the cities, there was a lot of movement by Christian businessmen and YMCA's and stuff like that kind of get going. And I think she's also right, and we're getting to that section, that this kind of evangelical movement, when they find that they can't dominate the denominations, find extra denominational ways to do that. And so, you know, then how do things start to get paired up beyond the denominations? Now, again, I'd say some of that's good stuff. I mean, why can't I, if I'm a Christian businessman and, you know, guys that I work with are good Baptist and good Episcopalians and, you know, whatever they are, why can't we do something together? But I think she is going to point out that, you know, then there are all of these media things to feed that in a narrow way. And you've been a pastor of a church to know how the bounce back to that sometimes comes as well. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Talked about, in particularly in the American South, Southern culture of mastery and honor seem to conflict with the egalitarian impulses of evangelical Christianity. But Southern evangelicals found a way to define Christian manhood in a manner that sanctified aggression, that maintained order and fulfilled their role as protectors. There were times when Christian men must resort to violence. And I wonder if she's suggesting kind of the lynching movements that were, you know, really powerful in the post war movement. Then we get Billy Sunday. I'll see if I can find a clip of Billy Sunday to send out this week, just so you all can appreciate. I mean, I don't think there's anybody close to what Billy was back in the day. And the Great War and kind of the evangelical revival movements that happens there. But then at the end of that paragraph that starts with the Great War, a new and enduring manifestation of evangelical revivalism took hold, one perfectly suited to the emerging consumer culture. So this is going to be the important thing. Revivals took place, before Billy Sunday, right? But there's a consumer culture, and how all of a sudden they start use business marketing tools that are developed during this period to kind of spread their work. Modern advertising techniques. I'm talking a lot about my dad today, and I don't really mean to, but one of my dad's favorite things to talk about when I was a boy was what it was like when the circus came to town when he was a boy. And of course, what would happen is, weeks before the circus would come, there was a whole group of people who would blow through town, who would put up those remarkable circus coming signs, right? And if you were to read, and they mentioned Sinclair Lewis in here, how many of you have ever read Elmer Gantry? We know who Elmer Gantry was, right? Elmer Gantry is this character. I'm sorry, Burt Lancaster, exactly. Yeah, there, the bright and morning star. But Elmer Gantry is this composite of evangelists of this time. And again, one of the things that they would do is there would be a group that would go through the town ahead of time, stirring up interest that this person's going to be coming at this particular point. So exactly, yeah, great movie. And small footnote, they turned that into an opera, and the premiere of it was here in Nashville. And I went to see it with a pastor friend of mine, and it was really very fascinating how they did that. Yeah. So borrowing from modern advertising techniques, evangelical innovators crafted a generic, non-sectarian faith that privileged individuals' plain reading of the Bible and championed a commitment to the pure, unadulterated fundamentals of the faith, branding this innovative approach old-time religion. Then they marketed this faith directly to consumers. Through religious merchandising and with the help of celebrity pitchmen like Sunday himself, they effectively replaced traditional denominational authorities with the authority of the market and the power of consumer choice. Fundamentalists who embraced this market-driven revivalism included rabble-rousing populists and respectable middle-class professionals, and tensions and infighting between and among these factions would characterize the movement for the next century. It was only through the identification of common enemies that fundamentalists were able to fashion a powerful, if unstable, identity. So really important. It's always easier to point to the enemy who we're against rather than who we're with. And again, my choice for reading this and reading it critically with you all is not to sort of demonize or any of that, but to help us understand what's going on in the midst of it. The fundamentalists. Really good question. So Martin Marty, y'all know Martin Marty. He used to be the question was, thank you, Carol, are there parallel issues going on within Judaism and Islam? And the simple answer to that question is yes. Martin Marty did a multi-volume series of books which I had. I don't think I have anymore. I think, again, heartbreakingly, they went the way of all pages. But on fundamentalism as an issue that is having to be dealt with in all these religious traditions. So the first time I went to the Holy Land was December of '95. I went 30 days after Rabin's assassination. Rabin was not assassinated by a Christian. He wasn't assassinated by an Islam. He was assassinated by a fundamentalist Jew who was opposed to his kind of broadening approach with the wider Middle Eastern world. So yeah, fundamentalism is a major issue, and it is expressed in a variety of religious commitments. We see that within Islam as well, and in fact, there are many really good pundits who suggest that we need to support within Islam those who are trying to do the work that really only they can do against the fundamentalist movement within their own tradition. And of course, one of the dangers that we see right now is the popular culture is only identifying Christians as those people, right? And we need to be very clear that we're not having the same thing with other religions. It's really easy, after 9/11, say all those Muslims are like that, right? And so we need, but I do think, and I appreciate very much the question, because I do think fundamentalism is significant. Now, what's really important that she points out is the rebranding as evangelical is to get away from that kind of negative term fundamentalist. And I would want to say, kind of anytime you have a church split, you automatically within that new entity have right, left, and center, right? I mean, it's going to be. And so within the evangelical movement, there are different strains of that, all the way from fundamentalist to more progressive, right? So it's not just that we can throw out the word and go from there. Again, one of the reasons I sent that article by David Brooks, because I think he does such a fine job of, and especially looking at how the fundamentalists after the Scopes trial kind of started to look inward and instead of kind of looking outward. But within, some of us remember the fundamentalist modernist controversy. She only kind of nods at it here, but the Scopes trial was part of that. But then within denominational seminaries, there was a huge split in Princeton Seminary back in the 1920s. And there was a professor that does get mentioned here, Machen, that broke away and started Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia and started a new denomination called the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. In the 1970s, the OPC pretty much aligned with the PCA. But it was there's a fabulous book, again, I couldn't find it in my study this morning, called The Broadening Church by a man named with this fabulous name, Lefferts Letcher. How would you like that for a name? And the worst part about it is he was a junior. His dad was a professor at Princeton, and he did this deep dive study into this split at Princeton, which happened in the late 1920s. I think Machen ultimately went away, but that Independent Board of Foreign Missions that does get mentioned here, there was I'll get you in a second, Rita. So there was a group within the denomination who felt like the missionaries were not fundamentalist enough and were being too wishy-washy, and so they started an independent mission board, and the denomination said you can't do that, and then they broke away. Rita? Right, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Rita said, for those of you online, that when she was a girl, her family was part of a Lutheran church, but became Missouri Synod and wanted to bring a friend to the youth group. And the leader said, unless she's a member of the church, she couldn't, and broke away from that. I served a church in Libertyville, Illinois, and across from us, catty corner, was a Wisconsin Lutheran church. And they make Missouri Synod folks look like wide-eyed liberals. I mean, it is just, you start to see, Martin Luther used to say that the sum total of church history is a drunk man falling off one side of the horse, getting back on and falling off the other. What did he mean? He means traditionally, we either fall on the side of grace, or then we get on and we fall on the side of law. The problem when you fall only on the side of grace is then you often get, things like sex scandals and all of that, right? You fall on the side of law, you keep breaking over doctrine. My sister, this class isn't all about my family. Okay, let me be real. I'm not working out my stuff with y'all. I want to promise that. I told you last week I've been listening, and I just finished this really fine biography of Tim Keller, the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian, the PCA church in New York City. And he studied, got his MDiv from Gordon Conwell, but later, after he became a PCA pastor, taught at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. They had a guy named Van Til, who was the apologetics professor and did presuppositional apologetics, right? Which is, let me unpack a little bit. Apologetics is that part of the faith that provides a reasoned argument for why you should believe. And Young Life and lots of things would do a lot of stuff around apologetics. G.K. Chesterton is one of the great heroes out of that tradition. Well, there was a guy in faculty, and presuppositional means we can start with, in the beginning, God. We start with the presupposition that God exists, right? Well, there was a faculty member on there who disagreed. No. We have to be non-presuppositional. I first have to argue with you to convince you there is a God before well, that didn't work. So that guy broke off and started his own seminary called Biblical Seminary in suburban Philadelphia. My sister goes to that seminary because she's convinced those presuppositionalists are all wrong. I'm like, Glenn, look at the damn forest, right? I mean, we are talking about trees here, and we've got a forest that's on fire, So this is one of the reasons my sister and I are not in communion, is because she is. You are looking at yourself. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Back to the book. Leslie. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah. Hi, my name's Guy. But I just think, some of these, especially with the folks who break on the more law side, right? This is one of the reasons I really embrace a generous orthodoxy. Okay. Y'all who've been in my classes for a long time, I'm pretty orthodox. Lane's a little upset about that at times, get a little broader, but generous orthodoxy. There's room in here for us not to all believe the exact same thing, but we celebrate, the work that Christ has done for us, right? Now, I will tell you, there are some boundaries. And you get some bad theology and you shoot a tangent and some really bad things can happen, but, all right. The modernist and fundamentalists did, however, agree on the need to masculinize the faith. So here she is, she's helping us see some of these strains that are happening in the Christian church, but then also looking at what are some of the cultural things that are happening that even if you are a fundamentalist or a modernist, these will happen. Let me just put a pause there for a minute. One of the great things to read, there was a pastor in New York City named Harry Emerson Fosdick. And what was really interesting about Harry is he was called to be the preaching pastor at a Presbyterian church in New York City, even though he was a Baptist. How many of you like the hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory? All thy people pour that. That's Harry Emerson Fosdick's hymn. And he wrote it for the opening of Riverside Church. And the background of Riverside Church is interesting. So Fosdick is preaching, and one of the sermons he preaches is, "Shall the fundamentalist win?" One of the most important sermons from this period. Well, conservative pastors in two conservative presbyteries in the Northern Presbyterian Church, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, overture the General Assembly to have them remove this heretic out of the pulpit of the Presbyterian Church, right? So all of this stuff is swarming even in the denominations. Well, he says, okay, I'll leave. And some guy named John D. Rockefeller, I think was the name, offers to help him build this church that becomes Riverside. So they're ready to go into it, and a disgruntled workman torches it, and it burns, and they have to rebuild it. But the opening hymn for the opening worship he penned was God of Grace and God of Glory. Fabulous biography of Harry Emerson Fosdick, and to look at him, you know, today, he looks more conservative than, you know, any pastor you've had in this church in a long time. I mean, there's no way you look at this person and say he is, you know, heterodox. But he too was trying to figure out how to open some of this. And this question of, I was saying about Lefferts lecture, the broadening church. Are we going to keep the church very narrow, or are we going to broaden, especially as new things are happening in the culture? How do we deal with that? And the Princeton trustees, what was really interesting about that was all of the other faculty on Princeton, except Machen, had all been pastors before they became professors. Machen was the only one who had only been a professor. And he was arguing for this very narrow interpretation. And the other ones are like, you know, golly, I've worked with people, you know, we need to have a little room here. Very, very interesting background. All right. I'm over on 19. During the First World War, these competing visions of muscular Christianity were caught up in a frenzied militarism. Liberal Protestants embraced the conflict as a war to end all wars. Fundamentalists, the response was more complicated than Sunday's flag waving might suggest. They were arguing, and it's always an interesting argument, that unless the nation is Christian, you know, we can't get behind it. We've got to keep it at arm's way. But then she shows how at the end of the war, things sort of switched around. For liberal Protestants, internationalists, the disillusionment was especially keen. Of course, what happened in the United States after the First World War? Isolationism really became a part. Rita? Yeah. Yeah. Then the middle of 20, she starts talking about the Christian businessmen. Bruce Barton's The Man Nobody Knows. I don't know that book. Carol, do you know it by any chance? Yeah, I don't know it either. Strength remained vital, but aggression and violence gave way to efficacy and magnetism. Yet many fundamentalists retain more than vestiges of the former militancy as premillennialists. Okay, how many know that word?
This is fine, but I, big argument here about on these messages to have a Sunday school class to the God in the, we had a radio broadcast that, and she did up an offering, and she did not give it to this church, but she was a great listening.
Yeah, so premillennialism is in theology the doctrine of the end times. How do we understand that? And there are premillennialists, postmillennialists, and amillennialists. And one of my favorite cartoons shows St. Peter at the pearly gates, and there are 3 doors, and each one is marked premillennialist, postmillennialist, amillennialist. And you walk through the doors, and behind them the paths converge. And premillennialists believe that there will be a great conflagration and mighty battle before Jesus comes in the last days. Postmillennialists think Jesus is going to come, then there's going to be a big war. Amillennialists don't have a clue what's going to happen. Yeah, Lois? Yeah, thank you. I thought the same thing. And again, with my mentioning YMCA earlier, I wonder if she is going to include some of those kinds of things along the way. I think you're absolutely right. What the Depression must have done for anxiety around masculinity, how do we support our families? How do we do any of that? Has just got to be incredible. And of course, how many of us grew up reading Look Homeward Angel, right? I know one guy did. And the whole thing about, go out and sell newspapers and, get to work in, all that kind of Protestant work ethic that was part of this. And so I think you're absolutely right, Lois, that there are a lot of different strains here. My sense is this chapter is narrowly, how do we get to John Wayne? And so she's throwing some things in here, but is not telling the whole story, and I appreciate that. Yeah.
I do think about this, but I never verbal. Why are our biggest arguments, the biggest things that can never be answered?
Yeah. That's a good question. For those of us who, some culturally, this premillennialism crops up time and time again. In the 70s, Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth was part of that. And I remember seeing movies at church where, there's a pot boiling on the stove, and the time is there, and somebody, has left their car, in the sense of the rapture is going to come, and you're there, and, we're all terrified about that. And the Left Behind series in our own age was, selling fear. And all of that very effectively made the authors of that incredible amount of money. But I love Niebuhr's quote that he could not talk about the furniture of heaven or the temperature of hell because Scripture doesn't give us enough to that. I think that some of this is a mystery, and we trust God, and it's not the central things, right? We've got enough to go on. But the premillennialism is kind of, you've got to do this because the battle's coming, right? That's part of the issue. You've got to be prepared because we're going to fight in all of this kind of militaristic language. Yeah.
We were hiding underneath our desk. Cool.
right, duck and cover, exactly, yeah, yeah, right,
In our dog tag, yeah.
yeah. Well, you were over there close to Oak Ridge, so yeah, you were ground zero for it, weren't you? Yeah. Well, I think that's real interesting because a little later, it talked about Billy Graham's crusade out in California at Los Angeles. And this notion that Los Angeles is the #3 spot because, you know, of this, of how wicked a place it is, you know? Yeah. I'm over on 21 now, I probably need to hurry along. Having failed in their bid to gain control of existing denominational structures, fundamentalists struck off on their own, creating vibrant array of Bible schools, churches, missional organizations, publishing houses, and other religious associations. But they chafed at their marginal status. And by the 1940s, they decided it was time to re-engage on a national scale. Rather than blundering about in isolated squads or platoons, they resolved to unite as a mighty army. And that's where the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, Carl McIntyre, who was a Princeton seminary grad, but he didn't graduate. He followed Machen. He was a student at Princeton when that break came and followed Machen to Philadelphia. I actually brought one book I have not purged from the library because I have a hunch that I bought this after I purged other ones. But it's by a guy named Edwin Ryan, R-I-A-N, and he was one of the really brilliant students at Princeton who broke and went with Machen, and later came back into the Presbyterian Church, had to confess on the floor of the General Assembly of the sin of schism, was readmitted, and his daughter was one of my professors at Princeton. And his grandson was a very successful executive presbyter in Atlanta Presbytery. Abigail Ryan Evans. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and most people don't know that story about her dad. It's a fascinating story, yeah. So, all right, so the other one is Harold John Ockenga. Is that name familiar to any of you? Some of you who are in the choir knew Bone, Connie Bone. Connie's first husband, Jim Schumack, who had been the pastor at First Lebanon and later was my executive presbyter in Cherokee, grew up at Park Street Church, where Ockenga, I've known a number of people who've come out of that church. Very strong church in Boston. So he was really one of the founding forces behind Fuller Seminary out in California and Gordon Conwell up in the New England area. Both were stated non-denominational but evangelical seminaries. A lot of Presbyterians were in leadership at Fuller, and many have come out of Gordon Conwell as well. Here, it says that these guys, the NEA, were the ones who decided that they would look for a new word, that fundamentalism was too narrow and pejorative in a sense, and they thought evangelical would be a more positive word. And in fact, they talked about this, instead of being defensive and drawing into the shell like the fundamentalists, the evangelicals would be more aggressive, and some of the ways they would do that was developing some of these institutions. Yeah. One person I would draw your attention to, the footnote number 14, Wuthnow, is a guy I read an awful lot for my dissertation, a very, very gifted sociologist of Christianity. Think the world of him. The path forward was clear. It would not be through denominational structures. To evangelize the nation, evangelicals needed magazines that could reach millions and access to the airwaves for national radio broadcasts. They needed organizations for missions and for evangelical colleges and Bible schools. They already possessed the resources and the brain power. What was missing was a network that would support and amplify these individual efforts. That's really important when in the 40s, these colleges started coming. Some of them predated that, but a lot of them came along that point. Another person I think is really good to read over on the top of 23, George Marsden. Read a lot of his stuff. In fact, I had one of his books as well that got gone out of my library about evangelical, this tracing the evangelical growth, really good guy. So this section about Billy Graham. How many of you, I mean, like Billy Graham and have been impacted by him? Yeah. I mean, there are folks in this congregation who will trace their joining Christianity through a Billy Graham crusade. I know as a 15-year-old myself, I sort of went forward. It wasn't Billy, it was one of his lieutenants, good Presbyterian minister from Charlotte. But I think it's interesting, his ability to tap into something. And over on the page, page 23, the middle of that, the Christian, he was a star athlete who become your life's hero. The Christian life was total war, and Jesus was our great commander. Graham's Jesus was a man, every inch a man, the most physically powerful man who had ever lived. In the intent interest of saving souls and for the success of his own career, it was incumbent upon Graham to prove that Christianity was wholly compatible with red-blooded masculinity. The Second World War provided an ideal context in which to make this case. I think also in the late 40s and 50s, the guys coming out of the war, and of course, so many of these guys are soldiers, and this language is connecting in a really powerful way. Where did I put it? Over on the top of page 26, because it talks a little bit about the LA Crusade and what kind of cultural things were coming together to make that such a success. But I wrote a little note, what good was done? How many of you remember reading the book Unbroken? Remember the story of Louis Zamperini? We would call it PSTD now after the war and after being a Japanese prisoner, some alcohol issues, but it was at the LA Grand Crusade that he's touched and turns his life around. I mean, so, I want to be really, really clear that there is good with this as well as maybe some things. Good. Janet, you first. Yeah.
And it starts with ridicule.
Yeah. Right.
And then get a doctor, or you move to fear-mongering, and we together and fight it down.
Right.
And I noticed myself like, what would happen if number one was the date and the agreement and, whatever, was not sympathy and not really.
Right. Yeah, good insight. Suggestion here that ridicule is one of the first parts that begins a way down the road to problematic. I mean, we think about words like deplorables, and I have a book up on my desk. It was a deep dive of traditional parts of Pennsylvania, where I grew up, that in the 16 election voted against the party that they traditionally voted for. And there was this sense that life had passed us by and we were marginalized and nobody took us seriously and all of that. And I think about that for the so-called flyover parts of our country, where maybe the elites don't live, and how do folks feel there with the dominant elite narrative in the country? Yeah, Rita, you were going to say something? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder too, Rita, if part of that was you had already been formed in your faith, right? You'd been formed in your faith. You already had a sense of that. How many of you all saw the Crown episode where Billy Graham is over with the Queen, and the Queen is sort of liking it, and Philip has got nothing to do with this. I mean, it's a really very interesting episode. I think I showed it in Faith and Film a year or two. Ruth Ann? Right.
Very Baptist, and I remember there being kind of conflict between the traditional denominations and things like the Billy Graham Crusade. I was naive.
No, I think it's a good question. The answer to that is yes and no. So the Billy Graham Crusade comes to town and invites local churches to get involved, and they're very clear at the end. And I think for me, I have a lot of respect for that. At the end of the crusade is you need to find a local church. We don't care what kind it is. You need to get in there and grow. I mean, it's very, very clear about this. And in fact, the Operation Andrew group that I work with was born out of the Billy Graham Crusade here in in Nashville, as a way of churches working together for Nashville, right? So I think that, but it's a simple, life is bad, God is good message in there. And I remember going to see the Prodigal movie. There were Billy Graham movies. So I mean, part of this is also packaging and commercializing, so we could all go. Yeah, Janice?
In the mid-1990s, Billy Graham came, and there was a group in the church, a significant group, minority in terms of numbers, but pretty big,
Of influence, yeah,
who wanted the church to provide buses
right.
to go to the crusade, 7 miles. But the session voted no, that
Right.
they were not going to do that. And a group of people, almost all of them.
Right, right. Yeah,
The church was founded in 17.
yeah. All right, talking here of on the bottom of 26 and then 27, he added a new twist, however, by wedding patriarchal gender roles to a rising Christian nationalism. And clearly, in the 50s, post-World War II, that is a period where gender roles kind of got redefined, did they not? I mean, during the 40s and the war, all of a sudden women are out of the workforce in a different way. All these guys come home and, things get renegotiated, not always in the best way, right? So that's part of this. In the late 1940s, there was nothing altogether unique about Graham's instruction to husbands and wives. Many other Americans, too, celebrated traditional gender roles in Cold War America. The communist threat positioned women and men in distinct ways. Men were to provide for their families and defend the nation, while women were deemed vulnerable and in need of protection. In this way, Cold War masculinity was intimately connected to militarism, to the point that they could seem inseparable. And then we get into Stuart Hamblin, the cowboy singers. I won't go hunting Jake, but I'll go chasing women. I have not listened to that song. I'm sure some of you know it intimately. I do not know that song. So we need to kind of get that. This string of celebrity conversions that puffed up Graham. The middle decades of the 20th century, millions of Southern evangelicals migrated to Southern California and other Sun Belt locations, lured by plentiful work. And, again, Lois, to your point, I think some of this is depression related. We think of the Okies, we think of Grapes of Wrath. Some of you I know have read the brilliant book, The Warmth of Other Suns, that talks about Black migration because of Jim Crow South. So, we have these migration movements, but all of a sudden we've got in different parts of the country, especially Southern California, folks who weren't there. I mean, Beverly Hillbillies, right, tells kind of that story in a really kind of funny way. The myth of the American cowboy resonated powerfully with the Sun Belt evangelicals, a model of rugged individualism that dovetailed with the individualism inherent with evangelicalism itself. The cowboy embodied quintessentially American notion of frontier freedom, coupled with an aura of righteous authority, signifying an earlier era of American manhood, a time when heroic white men enforced order, protected the vulnerable, and wielded power without apology. The myth of the American cowboy had been tinged with nostalgia from its inception. What do y'all think of that? Is that true? Is that up for debate? Is that, what do you think? Yeah, George?
Like TR went to South Dakota, with the Dakotas.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a powerful, those of us who grew up in the 60s, the Marlboro Man was such an icon of what does it mean, to be a guy. Y'all know I rode horses twice a week from 9 till 12. Loved me some horse. Yeah. But then this guy sings, "It's no secret what God can do." Do you know that hymn? What he's done for others, he can do for you. This is good stuff. And then during the post-war years, Southern California became home to a vibrant local music scene where Southern Baptists and Pentecostals set aside denominational distinguish to sing along the latest hits. Pat Boone. One of the things she doesn't mention in here that's so important is the Azusa Street revival, Pentecostalism out in California was really significant. Some of the great interracial churches come out of Pentecostalism in this period. And they, in a sense, are a counter voice to the white only stuff that the Christian church needs to look at. So Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of American evangelicalism, and what's been very significant in the last year or two is that it's been CT that has raised some very critical issues about white Christian nationalism and have been hammered from the religious right because of it. But CT has been the flagship magazine for the evangelical church in the United States. Yeah.
I didn't become a fan of it until much later.
Yeah. Yeah, I've taken it over off and on over the years. I can read it a little bit more critically, but I also, and those of you who've traveled with me on trips know that I use the Christian History magazine, which does a lot of good, but it's a subsidiary of Christianity Today. And it's, trying to help kind of orthodoxy get out there in a packaged way that people could read. But Robert Schuller and James Robinson got their start. Wheaton College, Fuller Seminary, National Religious Broadcast, NAE, Campus for Trade for Christ, Young Life, and FCA. All this was a fraction of the emerging evangelical infrastructure. And as Janet said, some of us were schooled in a lot of that. With a broader Christian market, I'm over in the middle of 30 now, replacing denominational distribution channels, authors and publishers needed to tone down theological distinctives and instead offer books pitched to a broadly evangelical readership. Together with Christian music, radio, television, Christian publishing industry, helped create an identity based around a more generic evangelical ethos. It was in this milieu that evangelical celebrities, singers, actors, and authors, popular pastors, and revivalists would play an outsized role in both reflecting and shaping cultural values evangelicals would come to hold dear. And it's curious fact that John Wayne would too. The heroic cowboy soldier, Red River, Fort Apache, reminiscent of the days of Theodore Roosevelt, Cold War Americans once again found themselves trading isolationism for new imperialism, this time expanding a free market at home and abroad, combining resurgent nationalism with moral exceptionalism. Americans divided the world into good guys and bad guys, and the Western offered morality tale perfectly suited to the moment, one in which the rugged hero resorted to violence to save the day. And then Wayne himself kind of takes that on. Saddle up, lock and load, entered the lexicon of American conversation. That time too, Wayne's embodiment of heroic masculinity would come to serve as a touchstone for authentic Christian manhood. I'm looking forward to this next chapter, not for the least of the great title, but for the fact is, I want to explore that a little bit. I guess in my own life, I never looked at John Wayne as a Christian hero, right? And it may be that I'm not enough in that tradition. So I want to see and kind of push back on that a little bit. I mean, I certainly see him as a type of American hero, but I wouldn't necessarily put Christian in front of that. So it's going to be good. Donna? I think he didn't consider himself a Christian in the way that perhaps Christian nationalism would see him that way. It suggested that he converted to Catholicism very late in his life, but went through multiple marriages. So some of the things, and again, we need to be really clear within evangelicalism, there are a number of different strains. One strain is piety, and piety is, don't drink or dance or run around with girls who do, right? There's that strain. There's another strain that's much more, I used to be that way, but I'm not that way anymore. And so, you would hear, well, that's how he used to be. He's no longer that way. And so he may fit into that. But I think those are similar kind of questions we would ask about other leaders who we may not see the fruit of the Spirit demonstrated in the life that they're living, but somehow we give them a pass because of one thing or another, because of what's projected on them.
Used to be that not anymore is almost a badge of honor.
Sure. Yeah. No question. Well, I mean, this gets back to one of the real fundamental issues of the New Testament, which is that we tend to privilege the Pauline conversion experience as the normative experience of how we got to Christ. And, young life, this was, I used to do this, but I don't do this anymore. I'm not going to do it again, kind of a thing, where, I was blind, now I see. That is the traditional narrative. It's a very different thing to say, gosh, I was raised with marvelous Christian parents and I had Christian grandparents, and they took me to church, and I had these wonderful Sunday school teachers, and I've known all my life that I'm a beloved child of God. And I mean, that is a really different. Janet? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Favorite conversation all time.
Yeah. For those who didn't hear it, Carolyn said one of her favorite bumper stickers was, "I was born all right the first time." So, yeah, I mean, I truly think this is, I can't tell you how many kids that I've had from youth group who've gone off to college have gotten with FCA or, some parachurch organization and come home and want to be rebaptized and want to tell their parents about what Jesus really means for them and, all of this. And I love it because, I mean, this is a new growth, but I'm like, yo, dude, let's talk about all of these Sunday school teachers. We are going to have marker moments in our life that are changes and where we understand God's grace more deeply. I can't tell you how many different conversion experiences I've had over 63 years of my life, right? I think I've told some of you a couple of years ago in the summer, we read Brian McLaren's book, Generous Orthodoxy, and one of the chapters in there is the 7 Jesuses I've known, and it is brilliant because he starts, as I did, with Jesus covered my sins on the cross, substitutionary atonement, and I can tell you other theories of atonement, but I can also argue for you that substitutionary, there is nothing that replaces that for the reality of my sins being covered. That, grace is, Jesus did that for me, for nobis, for us. And there's nothing that I bring to the table, works righteousness, my own goodness, that can make that relationship to God work. This is what grace is about, that Christ has done this for us. And golly, then I can follow the 10 commandments and the rest, not as a burden, but as a blessing, a guide how to live wisely and well. If you don't get that cart and horse in the right area, all of a sudden, your life is performative and I've got to somehow earn God's favor. Get off that bus. But, Jesus, Lord of all, of everything. That's a different Jesus than me and Jesus dying for my sin. And it took me a number of years to grow into that. So I love that chapter. And again, if anyone wants that, I can get it for you. But this realizing how big Jesus is, the evangelical movement traditionally has been about me and Jesus. And you all have heard my preaching enough to say, the cross has a vertical and a horizontal dimension. And it's that the evangelicals have tended to be only focused on the vertical dimension. And it can be incredibly individualistic about what am I doing in my piety and all of that. And I'm telling you, when Jesus is on the cross, those arms are wide for the world. That's a vision of the Christ of the whole world. That's a whole lot bigger than just, me and Jesus. And I think, we've got to think about that. And for me, the old evangelical in me doesn't want to give up this vertical. But as I've grown in my faith, it's that horizontal. How do we live that out to show the love of God to folks who are very different than us, right? And different in all kinds of ways than us. And if the cross doesn't have that power, we are truly missing. Now I'm starting to sound like an evangelical. I apologize, but I mean, this is non-negotiable for our understanding of what it is to be a follower for Christ. Okay, Ruth.
No concept of that.
Right.
It's
Right. Right. Exactly. Right. 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 Yeah, for me, how many of us sing? Yeah, we don't sing the hymn enough, in my estimation. here I raise my Ebenezer. What the hell's an Ebenezer, right? Anybody know? An Ebenezer is a bunch of rocks. And it's a sign that God has done business with you here. I got bunches of Ebenezers that have been critical turning points in my life. Sometimes it has been a renewal of my faith. Sometimes it's a reconversion of my understanding. Sometimes the Holy Spirit has done something that I hadn't. But in Companions in Christ, when we've done that class together with that marvelous curriculum, one of the chapters is you're invited to kind of outline your life history with God. It's an incredibly wonderful experience to look back and say, what have been the turning places? What have been the deepening places? And I think it's a poverty of our imagination of what conversion is when we limit it only to that. I mean, for me, there have been lots of conversion experiences along the way. Right. No question about it. Right. It is. And there are often two sides of the same coin. I mean, in the Presbyterian Church, we privilege God's movement in our own life, right? And God's power in our life. The flip side of that is, what is our response to that? And the Baptist Church and other churches kind of put the response kind of on the front side of the coin instead of the backside for us. And I think we need to have a little bit more generosity about that. My challenge is the narrowness sometimes about that. And that the thought that, okay, at age 8 or age 10, I now know. I mean, for me, that's the argument. When did I really know what it was to be a Christian? When I was 15, when I was 25, I mean, there have been plenty of ways along the way that all of a sudden it was like head exploded that this is what it really means now. Yeah. So for me, there's a certain humility that is not about me and what I've done and the decision I've made. And it is this notion that God has made a decision for me. And all of it is gratefully responding to that. But on the other hand, there are plenty of folks, some in this room, who can look back to that baptismal moment as a experience of incredible grace and empowerment. And I celebrate that. In fact, our liturgy allows for a delayed baptism so that somebody can claim those promises on their own. I think that's fine. But I also think, parents of children who are baptized as infants need to take seriously their responsibility in doing that. And we as a congregation need to take seriously our responsibility of supporting those parents and those children in raising those kids. We are over time, and I hate to be, but this has felt like a pretty good class. Okay. Right. Let me close us with prayer if I could. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this good conversation today, and for this book that's inspiring us to look at our own faith and the experiences we've had of growing up in those places where nurture has been real. And we need to also confess that sometimes when we look in a mirror, we realize that culture has come in ways to shape us. Help us to be free of all that we can to be more alive for you and your gospel, and that we might share that with others. Widen our sense of who's included. For there is a wideness in your mercy far beyond our ability to see. And help us also understand the gift of your grace in our own lives, that we might live out of that with joy and thanksgiving. Guide us as we go. Be with Donovan and Beth, we pray, and continue to restore them in this time of sabbatical and refreshment. Hear our prayer in Christ's name and for his sake. Amen. Thank you all. Thanks, Dan and Lockheed. There's a card for Lisa Atkinson, who is in the hospital, and invite anybody to go ahead